So today we're pleased to present to you Kurt Leuschner, familiar name, good friend of this library. Kurt is a professor of natural resources at the College of the Desert, where he teaches courses on conservation, entomology, field ornithology, native plants, and GPS navigation. He also teaches weekend courses and workshops on birdwatching, insects, GPS, and backyard habitats for UCR Extension, the Desert Institute, the Desert Studies Center, and the Living Desert. Now, whenever I introduce Kurt, it's totally irrelevant today because the birds of the Salton Sea I don't think are what we see in our backyards. I like to do just a few bird calls, so bear with me. No, that's not working. You won't hear that at the Salton Sea. But thank you for coming, and Kurt, they don't like my bird calls, but they're all yours.
What kind of bird was that, I wonder? I see. Can everybody hear me okay? In the back? Good? Okay. So thank you for having me, and it's good to be back. And I guess I can wander around, but I'll try to stay out of your way. I can't believe I qualified for a gold card event. That's pretty special. But I'm here today to talk about the Salton Sea. We'll get to the birds in a minute, but I'm also here to tell you about how great the Salton Sea is and hope that you'll do everything you can to help it keep going, because it's an important resource that we have. And I want to thank my good friend Steve Myers for providing most of these photos. I do photograph birds myself sometimes, but usually I'm too busy doing other things, so I do rely heavily on some of my friends for those. I'm also the president and founder of the Desert Cities Bird Club. It's kind of our local birding group. And if you'd like to be part of that, there's a little form on the back table you can fill out to join the club. Mostly I just need your email address, and you'll get our newsletter emailed to you 3 times per year. And occasionally you'll get a few emails from me, my ramblings about birds and birding activities here in the desert region. So feel free to join if you'd like. There's no cost to joining for the first year. Also on the back table, there's some free magazines if you're interested, and a few handouts on some of the upcoming trips that I'm leading and weekend birding activities, etc. But just email me anytime. One of those handouts back there, it's 2-sided, it's a bigger one. It's got all the information you need and all my contact information. So if you want to ask questions about birds that you didn't get answered today, or want to talk about bird feeding, or want to be reminded when a certain event is happening, whatever it is, send me bird pictures, and I can ID those for you. I'm happy to do all that. Maybe you want to convert your yard to a desert landscape, something more bird-friendly, wildlife-friendly. I'd be happy to consult with you for free on that too. So back to the Salton Sea. It's been in the news a lot, especially the last week, if you've been reading the paper, talking about some of the proposals going on. I'd like to remind everybody that before the Salton Sea was there, we actually had a much bigger body of water called Ancient Lake Kauai. It was 6 times bigger than the current Salton Sea, which is pretty big itself. So Ancient Lake Kauai was 100 miles long and 35 miles wide. It filled up most of the Coachella Valley all the way up to present-day Indian Wells. That was the North Shore. And it was 300 feet deep. So this was a fantastic body of water that has existed for hundreds of thousands and millions of years, coming and going. And the most recent occurrence of Ancient Lake Kauai was only 450 years ago. So we're not talking thousands of years or tens of thousands of years, just hundreds of years ago. Imagine this giant sea was in our valley. So when people talk about the Salton Sea as being a, quote, mistake, something that shouldn't be there, that's really not the correct story. This valley of ours, what's called the Salton Sink, over 200 feet below sea level, has a long, long history of having water in it. Like I said, even 450 years ago, we had Ancient Lake Kauai. So it's really not correct to say the Salton Sea is a mistake and we should just let it dry up because it shouldn't be there. If we hadn't dammed the Colorado River and diverted that water and used that water up, this ancient Lake Cahuilla would be occurring again on its regular basis. So there should be water in our Salton Sink. It's a natural thing. But regardless of whether you think the Salton Sea is natural or man-made, the birds have come to rely on it, and there's over 420 species, different kinds of birds that use the Salton Sea throughout the year. And we're talking of about tens of millions of individual birds using the Salton Sea. So over the past 100 years, since we've had the Salton Sea, these birds have come to depend on the Salton Sea, especially for the fish that are in it. And so since we've proceeded to destroy all the other options that these birds have, 95% of California wetlands are gone, I think it's our duty to kind of keep this Salton Sea going, because that's all they have left. It's all we've left them. So if we let that go, then, what are these birds going to do? It's a huge question. In ancient Lake Cahuilla, there were fish, and if you travel down to the Salton Sea with me, and I hope that you can sometimes we have time to stop at the fish traps on Jackson Street, and if any of you live over in the La Quinta Cove area, you can see the water line of ancient Lake Cahuilla on the side of the mountain. But we actually hike up to the fish traps, and I can show you where those are. I'd be happy to do that. And these were some of the fish that they were pulling out of those fish traps hundreds of years ago. Now to the Salton Sea, the current Salton Sea that's there. It's 35 miles long. It's about 10 miles wide, and it's about 25 feet deep on average. It's not very deep. It loses about 6 feet a year to evaporation. So if you do the math, if there were no inflows into the Salton Sea, the whole thing could dry up in just a matter of a few years if there were no inflows into the sea. Fortunately, there are inflows. The Whitewater River flows out of the Coachella Valley and adds some water to the Salton Sea every day. The New River flows out of Mexico, adding water. The Alamo River flows out of the Imperial Valley, providing much needed agricultural runoff to the Salton Sea. So those are the three main rivers that are helping to keep the Salton Sea from drying up. Now, if this water transfer that you've heard about and read about happens, then many of the farms that are in the Imperial Valley will not be farming, and without those farms, the water that would have been used for the crops that would have eventually run off and made its way to the Salton Sea will not be there. That water will be transferred away before it even reaches those farms for domestic use. Some of that water is coming to the Coachella Valley. The majority of that water would be going to San Diego because they really need the water down there. And so that's the situation we're in. And that water transfer is supposed to start in about a year and a half from now. So this is a really telling time for the Salton Sea these next few years. We're really going to see some changes, and we're really going to have to start dealing with those changes or figuring out another option. But for now, and hopefully for a long time, the Salton Sea is an absolutely beautiful place to go. It's fantastic and full of birds, and I'm going to give you a nice sample of those birds today. And after the talk, I'll be happy to answer questions. Now, this is a great time to go to the Salton Sea. Not only is the weather perfect right now, but the birds have arrived en masse, just like a lot of the people that are now arriving to the Coachella Valley for the same reason. And one of the things that you'll see down there are huge flocks of geese. Most of them are snow geese. There's some Ross's geese mixed in. Canada geese, not so common at the Salton Sea for a funny reason, but lots of snow geese and flocks of sandhill cranes, which are fun to see. So these are two of the species that people really want to see when they go down there in November and December and January and February. Those are 4 prime months to go down to the Salton Sea. But any time of the year you go to the sea, there's always something wonderful to see. In fact, some of the neatest birds that I'm going to show you occur during the summer. So if you're really dedicated, come down there with me in July or August. You know that bird, right? The blue-footed boobie. It's a real bird. It really exists. And this little book right here, maybe you recognize that, The Golden Guide. That was my book growing up. So back in 1971 or 2, I was just memorizing every bird and every account in that book growing up in LA. And I was reading about the blue-footed boobie in my Golden Guide. And there's a picture of it, and there's a map of the United States, and it just shows a little red dot right where the Salton Sea is. And the account says, only occurs at the Salton Sea. So even at a very young age, I was just dreaming of the Salton Sea. Like maybe one day I'll get to go to the Salton Sea and see a blue-footed boobie. And if you ask me why I moved to the Coachella Valley 21 years ago, this is it. I mean, this is the reason. Without that Golden Guide, and without that vision of the Salton Sea and the blue-footed boobie, who knows where I would have been. But I was determined to come to the Salton Sea, and I guess I never knew I'd be making this my home, but this was kind of what brought me here, the blue-footed boobie. And yes, I've seen the blue-footed boobie at the Salton Sea many times since then. And 2 years ago, we had a blue-footed boobie invasion. I think I told you about that in a previous talk, but there were over 107 blue-footed boobies at the Salton Sea at once. See, we're lucky to get one a year, and sometimes you can go 10 years with no blue-footed boobies, but to see 107 in 1 year, that was quite amazing. The same thing's happening right now on the coast, by the way. We've got this El Nino, we've got this warm water right off the coast right now, and the brown boobies, another species from the tropics, is invading our coastal California. I was on the Santa Barbara Island last Monday, and we counted 170 brown boobies out there. It's almost unheard of. And one masked boobie as well. Tropical species. So this El Nino is causing species to move around in ways that aren't part of their natural movements. It's not necessarily a good sign. What it means is they're not finding the food where they normally do, and so they're desperate, and they're just searching and expanding their horizons. So I think these birds are really hungry and looking for food. It really messes up our food chains when the heat comes. So as I mentioned, a lot of the birds at the Salton Sea are dependent on fish. Here's just a little selection of fish-eating birds. You've got the gull-billed tern in the upper left, the Franklin's gull in the upper right, the yellow-footed gull in the lower right, and the black skimmer. I'll get to these in a minute. These are all fish-eating birds, just a small sample. What kind of fish are in the Salton Sea? Right now, just one fish species is left. The salt levels have gotten so high that it's even too salty for saltwater fish to live in the Salton Sea. Can you believe it? It's almost twice as salty as the ocean now. And so the corvina that used to be there, orange-mouthed corvina, the sargo, and the Gulf croaker, these are the fish that people were fishing for in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. They're all gone. Too salty for them. They died out years ago. So the only fish left is the tilapia. The tilapia is a freshwater species from Africa, but apparently it has a very high tolerance for salt as well. So even though it would prefer to live in freshwater, it's still hanging on in water that's almost twice as salty as the ocean and rising. But how long can the tilapia hang on? We don't know. If these water transfers happen and the Salton Sea shrinks dramatically all at once, the salt levels are going to spike, and even the tilapia won't be able to handle that anymore. There's something like 400 million tilapia in the sea right now. It's a lot of fish and a lot of food for these birds. So the birds are happy right now. But the question is, what's going to happen in a couple of years? If the fishery collapses, it's going to have huge effects down the line, especially for these birds. And then the question is, where are they going to go? You know, they can't go to the coast anymore because all the wetlands are destroyed or developed. They're gone. They can't really go to the Colorado River anymore. That's just a little trickle now. They can't go down to Mexico where there used to be vast wetlands in the delta right before the Colorado River dumps into the ocean. Those are dried up. So all these other options that they may have had 100 years ago are gone because of us. And so for better or for worse, all they've got left is the Salton Sea For me, again, that's reason enough to want to care and do something about it. So us birders go to funny places to bird. We go to the dumps. I was just at the Borrego dump this past weekend looking at some pretty cool birds. Cemeteries can be good places to find birds because there's often some very old, stately trees there that birds like, that were planted a long time ago. Sewage plants. We love sewage plants. Whenever we go to a new town or I go to a conference or something, the first thing I ask is, where's the sewage plant? And what time do they open? And who do I call to get in? That's all I care about, getting in that sewage plant. It's getting tough to get in sewage plants these days. It's not easy like it used to be. But there's great birds to be found if you go there. And prisons. Prisons? We'll get to that in a minute. Oh, here's our prison slide. So what does this bird have to do with prisons? Well, these are 4 birds called long spurs. Long spurs. You've got the McCown's long spur. You've got the Lapland long spur. You've got the chestnut-collared long spur and the Smith's long spur. These are 4 birds that nest in the prairies and up in the tundra. The Smiths, you got to go all the way to Alaska, to Denali National Park to find it in the summer. But in the winter, all these 4 long spurs come south. And there's a little field right outside the Calipatria State Prison where these 4 long spurs occur in the same field. There's probably only one other place in the United States where this occurs, and that's over in Texas, where you could actually see all 4 species in one field. But the easiest and best place to try to do this is the Salton Sea and the Calipatria State Prison, which happens to be just a couple miles off the sea. And that happens in the winter, so about this time. It's long spur season. The Salton Sea gets a lot of strange visitors. This is a crazy looking bird called a ruff. This is the male displaying. The female actually has a different name. It's one of the few birds where the male and the female have different names. Her name is Reeve, R-E-E-V-E. So you got the ruff and the Reeve. And these are Siberian sandpipers. And if you can imagine Siberia up there and Alaska up there, sometimes these Siberian birds who are supposed to fly down to Africa start off on the wrong angle, and they end up flying over Alaska and coming down the Pacific coast instead. So just a tiny little mistake up there turns into a huge mistake down here. So instead of landing in Africa, they end up at somewhere like the Salton Sea. And that's how we get birds like ruffs showing up at the Salton Sea. So when a bird like a ruff shows up, this sends shock waves through the bird hotline. And birders will rush, they'll drop whatever they're doing, leave work, pretend they're sick, do whatever, get in the car, come straight down to the Salton Sea to see these birds. If you want to get on the hotline, see me after the talk. The one on the right is a snowy plover. This is a federally threatened species, so it's not doing very well because it nests on beaches, and beaches are places that people love to walk on and drive their vehicles on, so they're not doing too well. But they do nest at the Salton Sea, and it's one of their last outposts, you might say, the snowy plover. On the left is the very rare, at least for us here in the West, piping plover. This is a bird that's not doing very well back east for the same reasons, along the beaches of North Carolina and places like that. And every now and then one of these piping plovers shows up at the Salton Sea, along with the snowy plover. One of the most abundant birds at the Salton Sea, if you went there today, you would see probably thousands of these little, dark, submarine-like shaped birds floating on the sea. These are eared grebes. Why are they called the eared grebes? Because in the summer, they look like this. They've got kind of a pretty orangey, kind of an ear patch. Those are just feathers. But if you went up to Alaska, where they breed, you would see them looking like this. By the time they come down to the Salton Sea, they look like this. What do they eat? Nothing but fish. So this is one of those birds that's totally dependent on those tilapia and those little small fry tilapia. And it spends the entire winter here. There's 2 birds in this show. This is one of them. The other one is the white pelican that are extremely dependent on the Salton Sea because they eat nothing but fish, and a major percentage, we're talking about 80% of the entire western population of these species winters at the Salton Sea. So almost all of them are going to the Salton Sea. And without fish, you really wonder what's going to happen to eared grebes and white pelicans in particular. For now, though, they're okay. Here's a close relative, the Piedbilled Grebe. Pied means black and white, like the Pied Piper. Remember him? He used to wear a black and white cape. And so it doesn't really show up here, but this bill has a black stripe, and usually the background is a little lighter, more whitish than that, but it's got a black and white kind of a pattern in the bill. And that's why it's called Piedbilled Grebe. And as you can see, it's also a fish eater. That is a tilapia going down the hatch. Swallows them whole, like all birds do. Here's another fish-eating bird. You can tell by the weapon it's got on its front, and this is the western grebe, the western grebe. There's a similar bird called the Clark's grebe, but the Clark's grebe, the white comes up over the eye. In the western grebe, the black comes below the eye. So this is a western grebe, another fish eater. You'll see a lot of those at the sea. Here's the Clark's grebe. See the difference? See how the white comes around over the eye? So it makes the face look very different. See that? And also look at the bill. You see it's kind of a dingy yellow, kind of a greenish yellow, maybe a dirty yellow, whereas the Clark's grebe always has a much brighter, almost straw-colored bill. That's another clue. Two different species. I just threw this one in there for fun, just to show you. On their breeding grounds, the young ride on the backs of their parents. That's a Clark's grebe, maybe in Utah or somewhere where they breed. And here's their courtship dance. And sometimes at the Salton Sea in spring, you'll see them doing this. They're warming up. But if you go up to Fairbanks, Alaska in the summer, you'll see a lot of this on every lake. It's quite something. I know you're familiar with the Canada goose, but this is not a Canada goose. This is a cackling goose. A few years ago, they split the Canada goose into two species. So now the big guys that you see at the Eisenhower Medical Center are the Canada geese, and the little small compact ones, you see how stubby his bill is there? Look at that. And shorter neck, just a little compact duck-size version, is called the cackling goose. These ones nest up in Alaska exclusively, and they winter down here in small numbers. So check your Canada geese carefully. And by the way, they're not Canadian geese. Don't say Canadian geese. The name of the bird is Canada goose. They're named after John Canada. They're not named after the country of Canada, so they're not Canadian geese. Most of our Canada geese have never been to Canada and will never go to Canada. They don't even know it exists. Again, they're named after a fellow, John Canada. Look it up if you don't believe me. Here's an interesting dark goose that we see at the Salton Sea, and it's called a brant, B-R-A-N-T. Another goose that not as common. Now remember, the title of this talk is Amazing Birds of the Salton Sea. I think in the brochure it said Bird Wonders or something. Anyway, I'm not going to go over all 420 species here today, so I'm kind of focusing on some of the more special ones, the rare ones, the interesting ones, including the brants. This is something we don't see very often, but the Salton Sea is a great place to see them, like right at Mecca Beach on the east side. Here's the white-fronted goose, also another one you don't see too many of, but we often see a few at Unit 1 at the south end of the sea, white-fronted goose. And here's a really rare bird called a bean goose. This is another Siberian wanderer. Again, it's supposed to be in Siberia. It's supposed to migrate down to Africa, but sometimes, like a few years ago, they take a wrong turn and end up at the Salton Sea. Bean goose. This one, this was the very first record, by the way, of a bean goose in the lower 48, so it was really an exciting bird for people. Now, the winter is duck season, so there's a lot of ducks at the Salton Sea, and many of these ducks you'll see on the local ponds here too. So you don't have to go all the way down to the Salton Sea to appreciate a lot of these ducks. This one is the American Wigeon. This is the male. It's also called the bald pate. It's a nickname. It's got white on the forehead. American Wigeon. This is a very common duck, especially on small lakes around town. So watch for this one. It's called the Ringneck Duck. Ringnecked. Now, a lot of people wonder why it's not called the Ringbilled Duck. Because really, you don't see any rings around the neck, do you? But a lot of these birds are named for features that you can only really appreciate if you have a museum specimen in your hand, a dead one. So you can't always see the things that birds are named after. So anyway, it's called the Ringneck Duck, but don't expect to see a ring around the neck. But it's a very common bird. Last Thursday, I led a bird walk at Sunnylands here in Rancho Mirage. We saw lots of ringneck ducks. And by the way, I think you all know where Sunnylands is on Bob Hope Drive and Frank Sinatra. But why don't you join me for a free bird walk? It's this Friday at 9:15 a.m. If you all join me, I'm in trouble. But why not? Let's set a record. So come on, 9:15 Friday. It's free, absolutely no charge. It's 1 hour. Bring your binoculars. We'll have a great time. We'll see some interesting birds. And on Thursday, I'll be doing the golf cart tour at Sunnylands where we get to go into the estate. That one you got to sign up for in advance, and there's a fee. But Fridays is free. And last week in Sunnylands, we did see one of these. This is a Bufflehead, another interesting duck with a neat pattern on the head. How about this one? This is one we don't see very often, but when we do, we remember it. It's called the hooded merganser. And this is the male. And the male can actually raise this hood up or fold it down all the way like an accordion, and it disappears almost completely. Hooded merganser. It's a fish-eating duck. It dives. You see, it doesn't have a spatulate bill. It's more straight with a little hook on the tip, and that's an indicator it's going to eat fish, not plants. So this one will dive and go for fish. Now here's a more of a spatulate bill, right? This is the northern shoveler. Very, very common duck here in the Coachella Valley and at the Salton Sea, maybe the most numerous. At first glance, they might look like a mallard because of that green head, but look again. It's got bright rusty sides and this big shoehorn-like bill, northern shoveler. So all these ducks have just recently arrived from the north. They nest up in the prairies, in what's called the prairie pothole region of the northern United States and southern Canada. They spread out, nesting on various little lakes all across that region, and then they winter at the Salton Sea. So they're all here now. This is the wood duck. This one actually nests in tree cavities and will nest in birdhouses if you put up a wood duck box. If you live in a state where they breed, you can actually attract them. But they winter here at the Salton Sea in small numbers. This is called a goldeneye. This happens to be the female. The male has a darker head. It's a common goldeneye. And we'll see these at Mecca Beach. They like a little bit of a rougher surf. So Mecca Beach has that. This one's called a canvasback. Canvasback. It's got a very whitish back and a long sloping bill. Note how the forehead and the bill is just one long continuous slope, like a ski slope right there. And I want you to compare that with another one, this one, the redhead. Now these both have red heads, take a look, and they both kind of have a black and white pattern, so they're similar, but note how white the back is on this one, and then that forehead and bill that just are continuous. This one is the redhead. It's got some whitish here, but it's not as white, and you can see it's also got a big patch of gray there, so there's contrast. It's not just all white on the back, so there's one indicator. It's not a canvas back. And then when you look at the head, you see it's more peaked. It's got a steep forehead and a more typical maybe duck shape to the head with a steep forehead and quite a severe angle between the forehead and the bill. It's not that nice even slope like the canvas back. So even if you can't see the color, you can often see the silhouette of these birds in the distance, and you can start to pick out the head shape and figure out what they are if you know the clues, the field marks. This one's called the Ruddy Duck. This is the male. Hunters sometimes call them bluebills, but this is one of the only ducks whose bill color actually changes depending on the season. So in the spring and summer, their bill is a bright blue. This is triggered by hormones. But then in the winter, it darkens up and it's almost blackish. The blue bill disappears. But they always have the white cheek any time of the year. So that's a really good field mark. So again, even at a distance, if you see some ducks out there and they all seem to have bright white cheeks and stiff little tails, that's another clue. That's a ruddy duck. Very common duck here in the Coachella Valley. I think ring-necked, ruddy duck, and northern shovel are probably like your top three here in the Coachella Valley that you might see on a lake. Uh-oh. What did I do? There we go. Cinnamon teal. These are the males. Now this is an interesting duck. Of all the ducks I'm showing you, this is the only one that only occurs in the west. All these other ducks you're seeing are also eastern ducks. They occur, across the country. This one, though, is confined to the west, so you won't see this one back east. So if you're from back east, or you have friends visiting from the East Coast, and they're interested in birds, make sure you show them a cinnamon teal, because this is one they won't see back home. It's our special duck. A very pretty duck, too. This is the blue-winged teal. You can see why it's called that. When they take off, they've got a big blue patch in the secondary coverts. These feathers here are called the primary feathers. These are mostly for flight, okay? And this second row is called the secondaries. So primaries and secondaries. And the feathers that cover these are called coverts. So these would be the secondary coverts. These would be the primary coverts up here. So primaries and secondaries. I'm so used to going to the computer, I can do it all right here. I don't have to touch that. Here's a neat-looking duck. Anybody want to try this one? It's one word, starts with a G. No brave souls. It's a gadwall. 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 And it looks a lot like many female ducks. Many female ducks are kind of brownish, so it's kind of tricky to ID these brownish ducks if the males aren't nearby. But this one isn't so hard. Oops, sorry. If you look at the rear end, maybe I should have given you a different angle, but it's all black. You can see some of it there. But it looks like somebody's taken this duck and dipped it in black ink, in the back about 6 inches. So the whole rear end is just jet black. And that kind of stands out when you see them floating, and you can say, oh, gadwall. It's a big duck, too. This is not a duck. This is an American white pelican. I mentioned the eared grebe before. Well, the white pelican is also very, very, very dependent on the Salton Sea and eats fish. So the white pelican is counting on us to do something to keep that Salton Sea going and to keep that ecosystem healthy. I heard just yesterday, in fact, about a proposal I think some school kids or something have to, quote, save the Salton Sea. So they want to take the sea, and I'm glad they're thinking about this, but they want to take the sea after it's receded and all that lake bed has been exposed, and so we don't get exposed to all that dust that'll be coming our way. They want to shellac the ground. So, okay, like I said, at least people are thinking. You know, they're trying to come up with stuff. They're thinking. But the problem is they're not thinking about the wildlife in that case. They're assuming, you know, that the sea is going to shrink, and it probably will. There'll be all this exposed playa. But that doesn't really do anything to help the birds, does it, or the wildlife or the ecosystem. It might be good for dust control, and that is a concern, but let's also remember the wildlife and all of that too. But we do have a couple problems coming our way if the sea shrinks, and one of those is dust, and it's really windy today, so imagine if you add all that extra dust into the mix. It could be really bad. But my big concern, of course, is the birds. I'm trying to not let people forget that. Here's the brown pelican. Now, normally this is a coastal pelican, where the white pelican is an inland pelican, but at the Salton Sea they both mix. Because the Salton Sea is unusual. It's an inland body of water, yes, so you expect white pelicans to be there, but it's also salty, like the ocean. So the brown pelicans kind of feel at home at the Salton Sea too. So you do see both at the Salton Sea, although the white pelican is much more common than the brown pelican. This was the first bird to go on the endangered species list back in 1973. And after DDT was banned in 1974, the brown pelican made a great comeback, just like the peregrine falcon and the bald eagle did. So all three of those species have been removed from the endangered species list now because of the banning of DDT. And so now we see lots of them, which is good news. But they still eat fish, and so they're still counting on the fish. There are eagles at the sea. The golden eagle on the left is a resident eagle of the area, so occasionally you'll see one flying over, hunting, even over the Rancho Mirage here. You might see a golden eagle every now and then if you look up. And the bald eagle is a wintering bird only in this area. So sometimes in the winter, about now, we'll see a bald eagle or two either flying through the valley or going down to the Salton Sea. They like to eat fish. They do nest nearby. Up at Lake Hemet, there's a pair nesting every year. And Big Bear Lake has quite a few. And just last weekend, I was at Lake Henshaw, closer to San Diego, and there's a pair nesting there. And we were at Lake Henshaw on Saturday, and we watched a northern harrier swoop down and grab a coot. And he was struggling with this coot for about 10 minutes in the shallow water, trying to subdue it, because he was going to have it for lunch. And after about 10 minutes, and the bald eagle was sitting up in the tree and watching this whole thing. Then the bald eagle swooped down, scared off the northern harrier, because it's a bigger bird, and stole its coot and flew off with it and ate it for lunch himself. Exactly the reason that Benjamin Franklin did not want the bald eagle to be our national symbol. Even back then, he said it was a lazy thief and does not represent us well. And I guess he was right. Because that's what bald eagles do. They don't like to hunt on their own. They wait for somebody else to do all the dirty work and the hard work, and then they swoop in and just steal it. Lazy thief. So if Ben Franklin had had his way, I guess we'd be eating bald eagles for Thanksgiving, and turkey would be our national symbol. Because that was his suggestion, the wild turkey. But didn't work out that way. Another fish-eating specialist, I mean, look at that talon right there. That is a fish grabber if I ever saw one. This is the osprey, sometimes called the fish eagle, but it's an osprey. And they winter here. They don't nest here. They nest up in Wyoming and Jackson Hole and places like that. You'll see their giant nests up there. But they winter here. And over the years, more and more osprey have been wintering at the Salton Sea. It's been nice to see the increase in osprey numbers at the Salton Sea. But again, they all eat fish. So without the fish in the sea, what are they going to do? They're going to have to go somewhere else, and we're not going to see them anymore. But for now, they're still there, and the North Shore Yacht Club is a good place to see the osprey. So they swoop down, they see those fish from above, and they swoop down, and they just kind of spear them with that rear talon of theirs. And then they take them in flight. I have a picture of it with a fish, but actually while they're in flight with this fish, they manipulate the fish and move it around so that the head is pointing forward, and the fish is being held in kind of a vertical position because it helps them with flight. It's more streamlined. So it's fun to watch an osprey flying with a fish because they'll always turn it around, point it head first, and hold it vertically. No other bird does that. And then they go out to some perch and eat it. Here's another hawk that birders go to the Salton Sea hoping to see at the south end. It's called the Ferruginous Hawk. Ferruginous Hawk. You can also see them in Indio. So if you join our Desert Cities Bird Club, you'll hear about our East Valley Hawk Watch that we had. It's coming up on a Friday in December that I'll be leading. We drive around the back roads of Indio looking for hawks, and this is one of the hawks that we sometimes see. It's a huge hawk. It's almost as big as an eagle. Ferruginous hawk. So it's got a whitish tail, and it's got a lot of feathering on the legs. That's one of the good field marks of the Ferruginous hawk. This, of course, is the red-tailed hawk. You'll hear that one here in town. It likes open countries. It's our most common large hawk here in the Coachella Valley and the Salton Sea. They're here year-round. They nest in large trees or on cliffs. Now, from below, their tail doesn't look too red. It's just kind of maybe a light pinkish orange. But from above, you can see why they're called the red-tailed hawk. See that? Definitely a red tail. Now, if there's a hawk in your backyard, it's probably not a red-tailed hawk because, again, these guys like open country. Turkey vulture. They're always fun to see. I actually do a whole talk on turkey vultures. I think I did it here, right? Did some of you come to that? Looks like I need to do it again. Got a whole new audience. But I got a talk that I think you'll find interesting on turkey vultures. Maybe I'll come back and do that again. But they fly through twice a year in spring and fall. They migrate through the area, and we usually see them at the Salton Sea. And they're also fairly common here in Rancho Mirage during migration because you've got a lot of big eucalyptus trees and other trees that they like to roost in. Here they are in flight. They kind of hold their wings in a V-shaped pattern. It's not flat like an eagle. And one more of the turkey vultures sunning itself in the morning. Now, these vultures don't, and hawks in general, don't like to get up very early. They like to sleep in. So if you like to sleep in, then you should come back as a hawk because they don't get up till 9:30, 10, almost every day because that's when it starts to heat up and those thermals start to be created. And they're waiting for the thermals to come, these warm rising air currents, so that they can take advantage of it and get a free ride. So they're in no hurry at all to get up in the early morning. This is the small falcon that is here year-round, probably in your backyard. It's called the American kestrel. This is the female. The male has kind of bluish wings where the female has brownish. These guys nest in holes. Sometimes they'll nest in palm trees if you don't over-prune them. And they'll also nest in kestrel boxes if you hang them up. And they're good to have around because mostly they eat insects. This one appears to have some kind of a bug in its beak. They eat a lot of big crickets and grasshoppers and dragonflies, and so they're good to have around. They're kind of doing pest control for you. Sometimes they'll eat a mouse or a small bird. American kestrel, lots of them at the Salton Sea. So not only do we have the resident American kestrels here right now in November, we also have all the migrant kestrels that have come down from the north to join the residents. So the number of kestrels this time of year almost doubles. And it's mixed, residents and out-of-towners. Again, just like the people, so many parallels. Another falcon of note, this is the Prairie Falcon, and the Salton Sea is a great place to see one of these. Sometimes they're perched on a pole like this one, sometimes they're flying by. Beautiful falcon, here year-round, one of the fastest flying birds on Earth. Speaking of fastest flying birds on Earth, this is it. This is the Peregrine Falcon, and they also winter at the Salton Sea. And just like the brown pelican, they've made a remarkable comeback since DDT was banned, and now you see them all the time at the Salton Sea, sometimes many a day. They can fly how fast? Well, some people say up to 200 miles an hour, but that's not quite true. So stop repeating that. It's a myth. They'll probably even say that at the Living Desert. They're wrong. Somebody dropped one of these from an airplane to see how fast they'd go in a dive. And I guess it got up to 200 miles an hour. But that doesn't mean anything. If I dropped you from an airplane, you would go 200 miles an hour, probably more. Does that mean you can fly 200 miles an hour on your own on a regular basis? No, of course not. So those experiments didn't really get to the bottom of how fast they can fly. The fastest I've seen them being clocked is 170. That's still pretty fast, but it's not 200, right? So let's stick to 170 until we see proof, and not being dropped out of an airplane kind of proof. Another fast falcon is on the left. This is called a merlin. A merlin. It's in between the size of a peregrine and a kestrel, so it's kind of a medium-sized falcon. A lot of people don't even know they exist because they've never heard of a merlin, but this is what they look like, and I did see one this weekend, so I know they're around. They winter here in small numbers, and they nest up in Alaska. Again, you got to go up to Denali National Park. Maybe you'll see a merlin nesting. They winter here. This is always a fun bird to see. It's got this really crazy hairdo and this fish-eating beak and thick body. It's called a belted kingfisher. And they also winter here. They migrate to the Salton Sea, and they stay here all winter, feasting on nothing but fish. So again, dependent on the fish. One of the few birds, the phalarope is another one, where the male is not as brightly colored as the female. It's kind of a role reversal. This is actually a male. He's got a blue band here, but the female, if this was a female, she'd also have a kind of a bright chestnut band below the blue band. So she's got more color in her than the male does. So she's more colorful. It's unusual, but then when you look at their nesting behaviors, it makes sense because the male is the one doing most of the nesting duties. The female gets a break. So she lays the egg, but then the male takes over. He incubates, he watches the nest, he helps raise the young. He does most of that work. So it makes sense why he's less brightly colored. He needs to blend in. Great blue herons are always fun to see, very common, really tall birds. They'll even nest at the Salton Sea sometimes, or they'll try to. Fish eaters. Great blue heron in flight. Even around town, you might see one of these flying overhead. Just looks like a pterodactyl or something. They're just huge. Always fun to see. This is another bird in the heron family. This is called a great egret. This is the symbol of the Audubon Society. I think some of you know why, but I'll remind you why. 100 years ago, it was very fashionable to wear egret feathers in your hats if you were a lady. Here in the U.S. and also in Europe, it was big, big business. And so people were killing egrets as fast as they could because their feathers were worth more than twice the price of gold. I mean, you've seen what people will do for gold. You know, they get that gold fever, right? They'll do anything. So imagine something being twice the price of gold. So you can imagine how fast these egrets were disappearing. And we didn't have the laws that we have today to kind of help protect wildlife. And so just as these egrets were about to go extinct, which is around 1900, a group of ladies got together in Philadelphia, said, we got to do something about this. And they formed a group, and they called themselves the Audubon Society. And that's how it began. And that's why they made the egret their symbol to this day. So they rallied support. They got good people like you behind them to tell their congressional representatives to do something about it, and Congress eventually did. In 1906, they passed the Lacey Act. Other laws followed, and now it's illegal to hunt these birds, and you can't trade their feathers, and fashion has changed, and so the egrets now are doing quite well, I'm happy to report. Here's another one called the snowy egret, same thing, just a little bit smaller. Now notice these frilly feathers here. So in the spring, egrets, and especially the snowy egret, get these extra frilly feathers like this. And those ones were worth the most. So a lot of this slaughter took place during the spring because some people wanted the best of the best, and so they really demanded these feathers for their hats. And they have a special name. They're called egrets. A-I-G-R-E-T-T-E. Might be a good Scrabble word for some of you. A-I-G-R-E-T-T-E. It's an egret, are these special frilly feathers that really fetched a high price. Only in the spring. This little heron's called the green heron, tiny little compact heron, one that you might see around ponds here in town, fishing, wading. Here's another one you're going to see, but this one you'll see at night or in the evening. It's crepuscular. That means it flies around at dawn or dusk, but especially dusk. So right when the sun's going down, watch for these black-crowned night herons to take off. And they fly around, and they look like big owls or giant bats. And they make a sound that sounds like a frog croaking. It kind of goes, quark, quark, quark. So you've probably seen this and maybe didn't even realize what you're seeing, or you thought it was an owl or I don't know, some giant bat. But black-crowned night heron, they're quite common once you start to learn to listen for their quarking. And they eat fish and frogs and other things around the ponds. This is a rarity at the Salton Sea, but I saw my first reddish egret at the Salton Sea back in 1980, I think it was. But normally you see this in Texas or Florida, kind of the Gulf Coast. But occasionally one of them wanders up from Mexico. And it's just a beautiful bird it is. It's taller than a great egret, almost as big as a great blue heron. And here it is hunting. So what these egrets will do, and this one in particular, they'll form a canopy with their feathers over the water. That's what this one is starting to do. And they'll sit there and create shade underneath them. And the fish are always seeking shade. So the fish will swim into the shade they've created. They've got to be patient now. And then once the fish are in view, they spear them with their bill. Reddish egret. This one's fun to watch, and they occur at the south end of the Salton Sea, especially in the heat of summer, August, September. But this is your reward for going down there then, and this is the black skimmer. You can't tell in this picture, but the lower mandible is longer than the upper mandible by quite a margin, so that they don't meet. And that's because it lowers this lower mandible and flies along and skims the water and creates a straight line for about 100 yards or so. And that line now in the water starts to sparkle along the whole length of it. Just like if you put a little ripple in the water, it gets all sparkly. And that sparkle acts as a lure and attracts fish. Just like a sparkling Mepps spinner you might put on your fishing line. And so these fish come to the surface to see what's going on. They're attracted to this sparkle. And then the skimmer does a 180 turn at the end and flies along the exact same line that it did a few minutes ago with the beak lowered. And as soon as it hits a fish, it clamps down on it. Pretty smart. And you can see these at the Salton Sea, but if you really want to see one, go down to San Diego, park yourself next to Mission Bay, and that's where you can see this happening almost on a daily basis. The Salton Sea gets a lot of terns, T-E-R-N. They're all fish eaters. This is the Forster's tern. This is the gull-billed tern, one that comes up from Mexico, more of a tropical species. And this is the Caspian tern, the largest of all terns. Caspian tern with this big, thick, orangey red bill. All fish eaters. Gulls specialize in eating fish, although they'll eat a lot of stuff, including our garbage. Fish is probably the main thing on their menu. And this one happens to be the Ringbilled Gull, probably the most common gull around the Salton Sea and around town. So if you see a gull flying over your house, it's probably a ring-billed gull, so go ahead and call it that, and you'll be right most of the time. This one's called the California gull. This is the second most common gull after the ring-billed gull. Note the bill, instead of having just a black ring around the bill, it's got a black kind of a spot, it's not really a ring, and a red spot to go with it. So it's got two spots, but not the, go back to the ring-billed, see that? It's like a complete black ring or saddle, no red at all, no orange. This one's got kind of a combination. So when you see the orange, you know right away it's not a ring-billed gull. This bird's a state bird of Utah. So Utah made the California gull their state bird. Isn't that funny? You know there's a story behind it. So when the Mormons were settling Utah, they had some of their crops were plagued by locusts, grasshoppers. And the story is that the gulls swooped in and saved the day, ate all the locusts. And that's why they made the California gull their state bird. If you go to Salt Lake City, you'll see a bronze monument statue of a California gull. I've been there, I've seen it. It's right downtown. Now, further investigation has revealed by ornithologists that the story doesn't add up. They were looking at the time that the crops would have been ready for harvest and the time when the locusts would have come in to try to ravage the crops. And at that time of the year, California gulls are not in Utah. But the Franklin's gull is. So it seems that the Mormons misidentified the bird, and they should have made the Franklin's gull their state bird, but they messed up, and it's the California gull. Oh well. They're not going to change it now, so it's in bronze. It's done. This is the Heermann's gull, Heermann, named after a fellow of that name, Heermann. This is a tropical gull. This is a Mexican gull. So normally it occurs south of the border, but at the end of summer, kind of a weird time, but after it's done breeding down in Mexico, it flies north. It's called post-breeding wandering, and some birds do this. And so every summer or late summer, the Heermann's gulls come up from Mexico and spend a few months on our beaches, and sometimes the Salton Sea. So we're talking August, September, October, maybe even July. Beautiful gull, though. It's the only one with a white head and this beautiful red bill with a black tip. Very, very different looking. Now, this is the most famous gull of the Salton Sea, almost as good as the blue-footed boobie. Because if you look at the range map of the yellow-footed gull, another tropical species, you'll see that the only place it occurs in the whole United States is the Salton Sea. So you have to make a trek at least once to the Salton Sea to see the yellow-footed gull and to check it off on your life list. It's a huge gull. I don't know if you can tell how big it is. Just look at that bill for starters. Just massive. And so it's a giant gull, very dark mantle, and these bright yellow legs and feet. Very different than the western gull you might see on the coast, which has pink legs, bright pink legs. This one has yellow. So these occur at Obsidian Butte at the south end of the sea, yellow-footed gull. Best time of the year to see them is in the very hot months of August and September, post-breeding wandering. And last year, the Salton Sea had one of these, the very first time a great blackback gull ever made it to the Salton Sea. So it was quite an event. Normally you have to go to Maine, or at least the east coast, northeast, to see a great black-backed gull. So this guy was way off course. I don't know how he got here. Flew all the way from Maine. Probably didn't fly across the country, though. So he probably took the northern route. You know, there's a lot of ice melting up in the Arctic region. And areas that used to be covered in ice are now ice-free. So what's happening is some of those birds, like great black-backed gulls, that normally occur in Maine or Nova Scotia or way up there, are actually able to come all the way through now, following water, and end up in Alaska and come down the Pacific coast. This could be an example of that. Because to fly across country 3,000 miles over open land, not really going to happen if you're a great black-backed gull. Wow, look at that. This is the largest member of the Sandpiper family. It's called a Longbilled Curlew. And this one's bill goes up. This is the marbled godwit. Ruddy Turnstone. These are all birds that occur in the winter. This is the red knot, K-N-O-T. These ones go all the way to South America, and they just stop at the Salton Sea on their way for a pit stop. Oh, we saw these ones already. Snowy plover and piping plover. This is the mountain plover, another bird that's in trouble. It's a federally proposed threatened species. So it's not on the endangered species yet on the list, but it's getting close. It's not doing well. It summers in, say, the plains of Colorado and winters down in Argentina. Quite a flight. And it uses the Salton Sea as a stopping over point, or some of them actually winter at the Salton Sea. This is another endangered subspecies that occurs at the Salton Sea. It's called the Ridgway's rail, the Yuma subspecies. And this one's called the white-faced ibis. Now, for a couple weeks in spring, they get a little bit of white around the face, hence the name. It's not very impressive, but there it is. It likes to eat snails, so it's got the right kind of bill for that. And here it is in flight. It's just a really pretty bird. White-faced ibis. But don't expect to see the white face. Usually it's not there. Black-necked stilts are always fun to see and super common. And American avocets. Their bill curves up just a bit. Common gallinule or moorhen. Not a coot, but a close relative of the coot. Note that the bill isn't white like a coot. It's orange with a yellow tip. Two kinds of cormorants at the Salton Sea. One is the double-crested cormorant, and this is the neotropic cormorant. If you see that whitish there. I think you know this bird. Can't have a bird show without a roadrunner in it, so greater roadrunner. They're everywhere, including the Salton Sea. They do not migrate, so they're here year-round. They can fly, but they prefer to run. 18 miles an hour top speed. Here's what they sound like. And December, January, and February is when you're going to start to hear that, so get ready. It'll sound like kind of the cooing of a dove or something, but it's actually the roadrunner's mating call. So listen for it. Abert's towhee is a very local species, only occurs in southeast Arizona and here in the Imperial and Coachella valleys, including your own backyard. So you probably didn't realize you've got this really unique and local special bird in your own backyard. So again, if you've got friends from out of town who are birders or interested in birds, please show them an Abert's towhee. Because unless they live in Arizona, they're not going to have this bird back home. It's a brown, large sparrow. It hops on the ground under your bushes, eats birdseed, and it has a little black around the face. Abert's towhee. These doves are at the Salton Sea and also in your backyard. They're called Eurasian collared doves. It's the new dove in town, if you haven't noticed. Taking over our mourning doves. They're bigger, they're paler, they got a lot of white in the tail and that black on the back of the neck. And this is the very rare ruddy ground dove. Isn't that a beauty? But sometimes at the Salton Sea we see those. Ruddy ground dove. It's a Mexican species. Hummingbirds, just fun to throw those in. They occur here, of course, and at the Salton Sea. This is the Costas hummingbird. If you feed hummingbirds, remember, don't use the red dye. It's not good for the birds. And use 4 parts ordinary table sugar, white sugar, to 4 parts water to 1 part sugar. So 4 to 1 is the ratio. You don't need to boil the water, but at least use hot tap water to dissolve the sugar. 4 parts water, 1 part sugar. Change your feeders once a week. Anyway, you'll attract Costas hummingbirds and Annis hummingbirds. Those are the 2 that we have here in town. Western bluebirds winter at the Salton Sea. This is the male, this is the female. We always see lots of them. And mountain bluebirds, another special bird of the Salton Sea. Comes down from the mountains to spend the winter in the agricultural areas. Mountain bluebird. The loggerhead shrike is known as the butcher bird because it likes to hang its prey. This is a rufous hummingbird that was skewered by a shrike on a catclaw acacia. So I'm collecting pictures of shrike victims. If you'd like to help me out, please send me your photos. I don't know why, I just am, and maybe I'll do something with them someday. We'll make a nice coffee table book out of it. shrike victims, and this will be in it, and anything you send me will be in it too. Vermilion flycatcher, always neat to see. We see them at Sunnyland sometimes. Maybe this Friday we'll see one. Salton Sea, beautiful bird. Another view. If you do live in a country club or near a lake, watch for this bird. You probably got a vermilion flycatcher hanging around all winter. Phainopeplas are here and at the Salton Sea. They kind of migrate east-west, kind of breaking the rules. They eat mistletoe, which is poisonous to most wildlife, but they gobble them up. It's a very unusual bird, the Phainopepla. Crystal thrasher is a bird that occurs at the Salton Sea, around Nyland, in the mesquite thickets. Common yellowthroat in the cattails around the sea. Wood storks occur in late summer, post-breeding wandering, July and August at the Salton Sea, coming up from Mexico. Wood stork. Fulvous whistling ducks or tree ducks. These ducks actually perch in trees, very unusual. Another Mexican species that wanders up to the Salton Sea. And last year and in occasional years, especially El Nino years, we have magnificent frigate birds that start to show up at places like the Salton Sea, another tropical species. If you've ever been to the Galapagos, you've seen lots of these birds, but sometimes they come up here. And two real special birds that showed up at the sea in recent years include the roseate spoonbill on the left. A few winters ago, we had 4 of them down there, another tropical bird, and the rarest bird of all, the Ross's gull. This bird is so rare. It's like the holy grail of birds in North America. To see a Ross's gull is a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and most people never get it. Normally, you have to go to Point Barrow, Alaska. You know where Point Barrow is? It's the northernmost point in the whole United States. So they don't have regular plane flights to Point Barrow. So you got to go to Anchorage, you got to go to Fairbanks, and you got to charter a plane to fly you to Point Barrow. And then maybe you got to wait there a week before they come back to get you. And while you're waiting, you set up your spotting scope on the beach there, and it's cold. It's really cold. Because this is the fall usually. There's ice out there on the sea. And you point your scope on the Arctic Ocean, and you hope that a little white speck might fly by about 500 yards off the shore. And after hours and days of doing this, somebody will finally yell, "There's a Ross's gull!" And you'll see this little spot fly through your scope, and then it's gone. And then you got to decide, did I see it well enough to count it or not? I don't know. That's your decision, personal decision. Birding is honor system. But that's most people's Ross's gull experience, if they've even had that. I don't think most of us will even get to Point Barrow, right? So to have one at the Salton Sea was the most amazing bird that's ever been at the Salton Sea and probably ever will be. And it happened in November in 2006. And it was on a Friday night. And I was just about to go to sleep, just checking my email one more time. I thought, okay, I'll just check it, 11 o'clock at night. Bam, this email just popped up. Ross's gull at Salton Sea. You know, I just flipped out. And I was supposed to teach a class or something the next day. Cancel immediately. Was not going to happen. On the phone to a couple friends, you know, waking them up, saying, we're going to Salton Sea tomorrow, 4 a.m., get ready, you know, I'm picking you up. I mean, Ross, can you imagine a Ross's gull at the Salton Sea? Saved me a trip to Point Barrow for one. And anyway, just an amazing bird. It's never been sighted further south than the Canadian border. I mean, so this bird was so far off course, just amazing. But there it was at the Salton Sea. So we got in the car. We were there right at daybreak, 6 a.m. We were there at Red Hill Marina. There was already 100 birders there with cameras and scopes, you know, paparazzi, just all circling this poor little gull in the little bay right there, just feeding on flies. These people drove all night from Northern California, from LA, from everywhere. There were people chartering planes from back east, from Florida, from Texas, because they don't get this bird there. And they need it for their list badly. They got to check it off. So anyway, I got to see it. I'm so happy I was in town and not away that day, because at 10 o'clock a.m. that morning, it flew off to the east and was never seen again. So that was it. The Ross's Gull. Amazing. And birders were still arriving all Saturday afternoon and all Sunday, and very disappointed. So when you try really hard for a bird and you don't get it, it's called dipping. That's the term. So this was a big dip for a lot of people. They flew all the way out here, no Ross's Gull. And that's why I live here in the Coachella Valley, because I need to be near the Salton Sea, because if a Ross's Gull shows up, I got to be close. So that's a good example of that. This is why I live next to the sea. It's such a unique and special place. And, we always see burrowing owls when we go down there, so I hope you might be able to join me in January. I've got 3 trips planned to the Salton Sea with the Living Desert, so you can book that on their website, or if you're a member of the Living Desert, just call them up and sign up. But they're all-day car caravan trips. We go all the way around the sea, stopping at all the different places, and we always see burrowing owls. I never get tired of seeing those, and they're there year-round. And I think that's the end of the show.